You guys keep asking me to ruin my own metaphors, like ruin my own symbols by explaining them. I like hearing your guys' ideas about it. Who cares what I think? I'm just the asshole who made it. Who cares?
This video is the first in a series that's going to be exploring what might be involved in approaching YouTube videos as art. I'm a film scholar, and my field, film studies, is still at the early stages of figuring out how we should think and write about YouTube, at least if we're wanting to talk about its videos themselves. I'm new to researching this topic myself, so I've got a lot more learning, thinking and watching to do. All that this video is going to do is lay out a few initial ideas and some possible future lines of inquiry. The main issues I'll be introducing here are 1. Whether it makes sense to regard some YouTube videos as audiovisual artworks. Spoiler, I think it does. 2. Some reasons why this might make sense. 3. Some reasons why it might matter whether we treat a YouTube video as an artwork or not. 4. The possibility that the YouTuber ContraPoints makes not only artworks, but a new YouTube-specific category of artwork. And 5. Why defining YouTube art might be able to tell us something about YouTube, and maybe about art too. So, let's get the series started. I'm going to use as my starting point a clip from a video that I found to be a true inspiration for thinking about these topics. It was made by a YouTuber called Sarah Zedig, who coined the term YouTube art. We'll be returning later to some of her arguments.
There's an opinion that what a person thinks of when they think of YouTube is anathema to art. That art and YouTube are mutually exclusive. And that's nonsense. People have said that about every new medium and they have always been wrong. But this does beg a question. What does YouTube art look like?
Yeah, so this is like a big existential question that I ask myself every day. And is what I'm doing entertaining activism? Or is it socially conscious entertainment? Like, I do care about like the art of it. As far as what I'm doing on YouTube, is it art? Is it political commentary? I mean, it's kind of both.
When does it make sense to regard a YouTube video as an artwork? This isn't a question that's been on the mind of most YouTube scholars. In contrast to the initial discussions that circulated around, say, photography and filmmaking in their early years, the first questions that scholars have asked about 21st century forms like online video or platforms like YouTube haven't usually included, is this a new artistic medium? Is it producing new genres of art? This is because of certain intellectual trends that have been dominant in film, TV, media and cultural studies for several decades. Very broadly speaking, there's been a tendency for scholars to feel more comfortable calling all audiovisual texts culture, rather than debate whether this or that text is also art. Everything is culture, looked at in a certain way. Virtually every activity and institution devised by humans can usefully be studied as a cultural practice, including art. Art is just a specific kind of cultural practice. But it is nonetheless a specific kind, made with particular sorts of purposes, and it invites us to engage with it in particular ways. And while it's obvious that every single video on YouTube could be viewed as audiovisual culture, it's less obvious which of them can also be viewed as examples of that specific kind of culture that we call art. I think this is an interesting question, and it's one that we've barely even begun to ask. Or at least, scholars like me haven't. YouTube creators themselves have been far more interested in this question, and they seem far closer to finding answers. I think that we academics could stand to learn something from this, both from the very fact that YouTubers are interested in discussing the arthood of YouTube videos, and from the discussions themselves. With that in mind, let's return to Sarah Zedig's video essay about YouTube art. Something that Zedig says early on in her video gives a hint about one reason why we might sometimes want to distinguish between art and other things in culture.
I'd hesitate to even call most of the things on YouTube art. Now, I don't think it's controversial to say that there is art on YouTube, but it isn't YouTube art, so to speak. A short film hosted on YouTube is taking advantage of the platform, but it isn't of or for the platform. It isn't what people think of when they think of YouTube.
I want to return in a later video to this idea that there's art on YouTube that isn't YouTube art. More pressing as a starting point is this idea of what people think of when they think of YouTube. Clearly, Zedig doesn't think that YouTube and art are mutually exclusive, but she also doesn't think they're automatically the same. This raises a fundamental point. An audiovisual text isn't automatically an artwork. The written word can be used to create literature. That's the name we've given to the mode of writing that uses this medium for primarily artistic purposes. But we don't tend to treat every single thing that human beings write as automatically belonging to that mode of writing we call literature. Likewise, we don't automatically treat every type of image as belonging to that mode of image we call visual art, or treat every sort of performative act as an instance of performance art. So it would seem to make sense not to automatically treat every single piece of audiovisual footage as audiovisual art, whether it's on YouTube or not. But if lots of videos belonging to what we think of when we think of YouTube aren't necessarily best thought of as art, what are they best thought of as? They're certainly all examples of audiovisual culture, but can we be more precise? At another point in her video, Zedig describes YouTube like this.
YouTube, I think we can all agree, is a strange intermediary medium that we don't tend to approach the same way we do television or film.
A strange intermediary medium. This made me think of a claim the media theorist Sean Cubitt made back in 1998 when we still said cyberspace. He argued that cyberspace is increasingly rewriting the boundary demarcations between art and communications media. I think this may be true, though the internet is hardly unique in this respect. TV, for instance, has long been discussed as both communication and as art, and it can certainly sometimes blur the two. But to figure out what might be truly new about our networked digital age, we might need to go back to a much older and even more everyday medium, writing. The written word is a medium that anyone who's watching this video could, right this second, decide to use to make different types of text. You could choose to make a text that we would think of as a communication, or you could make a text that we would think of as art. Till fairly recently, most of us couldn't have chosen to do the same in the audiovisual medium. Today though, that's far more possible. This has the potential to make the line between art and communication just as blurry for the audiovisual medium as it long has been for the written word. What the hell am I talking about? Well, let's think of two things, one that's a fairly unambiguous example of communication, and one that's a fairly unambiguous example of art. On the one hand, a phone call, and on the other, a movie, say Vertigo. These two things seem pretty easy to place in these two categories. One is just a single step away from face-to-face communication, the other is an example of one of the main audiovisual art forms, the narrative film. The line between these, though, have a greater potential to become blurred in the 21st century. Think of a video call. That's kind of like a movie. At the very least, it's audio-visual, it's made up of sight and sounds, we could watch it on a screen. Maybe this still feels uncomplicatedly like communication. For one thing, it doesn't really feel like an object, a text, in the way a movie does. So maybe this is just a fancier version of a phone call. What if you record that video call? Suddenly, you've now got an audiovisual text that you could queue up to play in your media player the minute Vertigo finishes. That blurs the line a little bit further. Maybe we'd say, well, that's just a recording of an act of communication. It was originally a two-way process. It still isn't made or viewed in anything like the same way as a movie. So in that case, Think of a video that you make of you talking into your phone that you send to someone. Like a movie, this is an audiovisual text that was made in the past, independently of any simultaneous communication. Maybe we might want to say, well, if you only send it to one person, that means it's still got one foot in the realm of the phone call, the realm that's unambiguously communication. So now imagine that instead of sending that video to your friend, you upload it to YouTube. By this point, we've basically reached the vlog. And so, is it closer to an act of communication or closer to a movie? That video you shot on your phone has definitely become an audiovisual text. Has it also become an audiovisual artwork? I suspect that at this point the answer probably has to start depending on the nature of the particular video you've uploaded to YouTube. Basically, on how it uses the audiovisual medium and how your audience interacts with it. I'm going to come back to all this. First though, let me back up and say that the reason I found myself wanting to write about YouTube at all is because I wanted to write about one particular YouTuber, Natalie Wynn, also known by her channel's name ContraPoints. If you haven't heard of her, then introducing you to her is by far the most valuable thing that this video will accomplish. Setting up who she is requires acknowledging a depressing fact. The ecosystem of user-generated political commentary on YouTube has long been swamped by right-leaning to far-right voices.
What I want to be? Do I want to be a political commentator or do I want to be an artist? I mean, I want to be an artist, to be honest. I've always wanted to be an artist, and that's what I want most deeply. I also happen to live in a time where I feel like you have to be political because of how fucked up the situation is.
For around 3 years now, ContraPoints has been leading an overdue resistance against this so-called alternative influence network, spearheading a currently fast-growing loose collective of further left and liberal video creators, often referred to by its members and fans as LeftTube, and sometimes also, more cryptically, BreadTube. There are many valuable ways that Wynn and LeftTube more broadly could be studied. For instance, one way of understanding her would be to approach her as a YouTube activist, or at least educator. A key role she's performing is debunking the talking points of fascists, conservatives and reactionaries in imaginative ways, apparently persuading some of her audience away from alt-right sympathies, or, in Wynn's withering words,
de-radicalizing young alt-right men.
Her videos concern topics ranging from white nationalism to capitalism to, most often, the philosophy of feminist and transgender politics. The broad genre that her work has evolved within seems to chime with this view of her being an activist or educator. It's a widespread genre of YouTube video that I still don't think we have quite the right word for. I've used the word vlog a couple of times, and this term maybe fits if we go by the Cambridge Dictionary's extremely roomy definition: a video blog, a record of your thoughts, opinions or experiences that you film and publish on the internet. But ContraPoints and LeftTube generally don't usually make what most today think of when hearing the word vlog. They're more a mixture between the vlog and the audiovisual essay, both forms that can mobilize what Dawson calls YouTube's hybrid discourse of the ordinary expert. Essentially, the bare bones conventions of the form are filming something resembling a lecture, delivered both to camera and via voiceover, complemented by music, found footage clips, some written text, and sometimes cutaways to comic skits. Basically, a video essay with vlog-like characteristics. And by the way, if you have a snappy term for this genre, please for the love of God tell me in the comments. Whatever we call it, Wynn's videos began firmly within this mode. However, increasingly, they've been evolving their own instantly identifiable aesthetic, especially since she came out as trans about 2 years ago. They're now this baroque, darkly comic, defiantly queer mixture of John Waters, Dario Argento, drag balls, Monty Python, and the style of other YouTubers. One immediately striking aspect of the ContraPoints aesthetic is that many, though by no means all, of Wynn's videos have been populated by a growing cast of fractious fictional characters for whom she writes heated arguments, from Freya the fascist to Tiffany Tumbles, a Trump-loving, self-hating trans woman, all embodied by Wynn herself. These character-focused videos typically stage irresolvable serio-comic camp dialectical debates between characters on particular topics. Her work in general can sometimes resemble more, say, the satirical performance or video art of Rachel McLean or Hito Stoll than the more conventionally vlog or lecture-like communiques of some of her LeftTube allies.
Want me to play? You want me to go down your red carpet and be your fucking Barbie doll? Be your fucking Barbie doll. You want to play? Let's go.
I'll show you an extended clip to show you what I mean. It's from a video opportunely titled The Aesthetic. The bulk of this video is dedicated to dramatising an uneasy duologue between two transgender women, both recurrent ContraPoints characters, the anarcho-communist cat girl Tabby, and her friend, the left-leaning but considerably less radical Justine, both played by W.A.V.E. W.A.V.E doesn't appear as herself at all in this video, though we first see her addressing the camera as one of her many drag-style host personas. The inciting incident for the argument that you'll see begin between Tabby and Justine is that Tabby has made an ill-fated appearance as a guest on a TV talk show. While on the talk show, Tabby was subjected to and pushed back against some aggressive misgendering by another guest, the brilliantly named transphobic feminist Abigail Thorn.
But perhaps you disagree, sir. That's a human rights violation! I'll smash your fucking face.
So, in the following clip, after W.A.V.E's host character has spoken, you'll see Justine start a debate with Tabby about whether trans women in the public eye should adopt a strategy of appearing traditionally quote-unquote feminine in order to win public support.
Gender's just like color. Some people see yellow, some people see blue. It's all a matter of opinion. Or is it? It's not. Let's hear the real tea. Tabby, sweetie, baby, princess. I feel ridiculous in this dress. Yeah, well you look ridiculous, because you wouldn't take the goddamn cat ears off. I think I'm gonna take the dress off. Well, don't do that. I'm trying to help you out, girl. If you don't want to get misgendered, it helps to femme it up a little. I'm gonna take it off. Well, don't leave. You can change in front of me. I'm not a prude. I'm gonna go behind the curtain. I like looking at naked people. Why do you always hit on me? I thought you were into men. Well, I swing both ways. I like boy dick and girl dick. That's not how that works. I hate that. The heart wants what it wants. Why did you invite me over here anyway? I saw what happened to you on the Freedom Report, and girl, you cannot be a trans woman on TV threatening people with a bat. You think it's morally wrong to stand up to your oppressors? No, morally wrong. What does that even mean? It was much worse than morally wrong. It was aesthetically wrong. It was unfeminine. This is all you ever say to me. It's bad optics. It's bad aesthetics. Well, does reality matter at all to you? Because the reality is I am a woman. And maybe a bunch of ignorant people don't think I look like one, but the way things look isn't all that matters.
So, I think it's immediately obvious that this video is several degrees more stylized and several degrees more theatrical than most vlogs or video essays. It's got multiple characters, it takes us through 2 fictional diegeses, it has an original score by regular ContraPoints composer W.A.V.E, and it features densely textured lighting and decor, shot reverse shot editing, symbolic props like the T, and so on. But why might it matter whether we approach a video like this as an artwork? I think there are probably a couple of reasons. First though, let's try to dispense, probably too quickly, with a fairly self-evidently bad reason for wanting to claim any YouTube video is an artwork. That reason is to assert that video's superiority over other types of YouTube video. The problem, essentially, is that this concept has historically trended overwhelmingly towards elitism. It's very often been used to elevate whatever works are deemed art by denigrating the value of whatever other types of work are deemed non-art, at least within the Western canon. And usually, the work that's deemed non-art coincidentally also aligns with tastes deemed to be working class, or feminine, or non-white, or you get the picture. So defining the boundaries of arthood in practice often just becomes a way for the gatekeepers of what counts as legitimate culture to exercise cultural capital. Or, as Ian Danskin of the YouTube channel Innuendo Studios puts it,
they see it as a label, a status symbol, and they don't want to see that status applied in places that don't feel appropriate to them.
This evaluative, legitimizing approach to the question of what constitutes art is something we absolutely have to be wary of, and unfortunately I think we can sometimes see it being used in some discussions around ContraPoints. But as well as being dubious for political reasons, this evaluative approach just isn't a good method for distinguishing anything's arthood. That's because it's obvious both that something can be supremely valuable without being art, most things are in fact, and also that something isn't achieving anything of value simply by belonging to the category artwork. There are plainly very bad instances of audiovisual media, for instance, that are still art.
How much is it?
It'll be $18.
Here you go. Keep the change. Hi, doggy.
You're my favorite customer.
Thanks a lot. Bye.
And all kinds of very good audiovisual media that it wouldn't seem to make sense to treat as art.
And what will it mean for the wider region? I think one of your children has just walked in.
So, I think the evaluative approach to the concept of art needs avoiding. At the same time though, the very fact that conversations like these are happening around the work of ContraPoints and other YouTubers actually indirectly hints at a potentially more justifiable reason for considering their arthood. According to one influential argument in the philosophy and sociology of art, the very fact that conversations like these are happening around ContraPoints and other YouTubers effectively confers art status on their videos, because they're being treated as art by what I think it would be reasonable now to call an emerging YouTube-centric art world. This is the so-called institutional theory of art, developed by figures like Dickey and Becker. It argues that, in Graham's words, art is what the art world decides it is, while also recognizing that there are different art worlds, each with its own history. An art world is made up of practitioners, critics, audiences, and institutions all together. In Becker's words, a network of people whose cooperative activity produces the kinds of artworks that the art world is noted for. I think we can certainly say that just these kinds of networks have developed on and around YouTube. There are numerous online communities surrounding many different genres of video, regularly spawning discussions of those genres as art, and sometimes debating which examples should count as artworks and which shouldn't, from the video essay to the YouTube poop, from vlogging to vidding to ASMR. And while it's true that the word art can sometimes just get applied to videos simply in order to assert their superiority, I don't think it's fair to say that the question of arthood is always, or even usually, being raised for evaluative reasons. For one thing, YouTubers will sometimes say that they think of different videos they make differently, some as art, others as not. And, more generally, a lot of these art world discussions are less about value than they're about interpretation. They're about trying to figure out what kind of work is being made and the consequences of this for how we should understand it. Within LeftTube, for instance, talking about something as art is likely to also involve talking about what this means for its political responsibilities. Towards the start of this video, we heard Natalie Wynn debating whether to think of herself as an artist or an activist who simply uses artistic flourishes, and she refers to this as an existential question, an internal struggle, which suggests quite how crucial it is to her conception of herself as a creator. Similarly, Oliver Thorn of PhilosophyTube has spoken often about shifting in the way that he thinks about his work, from making educational videos to making what he thinks of as artworks.
To me, making videos is like art. I've sort of changed in my ways. I used to be like making lectures, but really in the last 6 months, I started viewing it as making art.
I'm going to spend the rest of this video trying to articulate why I think this issue of arthood should also matter to viewers and critics. But putting my argument in the simplest form possible, I'd simply say that whether we think something is art is likely to change the way we interpret it. And also, distinguishing art from other kinds of things on YouTube might be able to tell us something about YouTube specifically. So I now want to elaborate on these ideas with the help of that video essay that first asked the question, what does YouTube art look like? Its creator, Sarah Zedig, is both a fan of Wynn's and a fellow LeftTuber. Her video essay is first and foremost an analysis of the nature and reception of that ContraPoints video we watched a clip of earlier, the aesthetic. So in that sense, this work by Zedig is in itself an illustration that there exists an art world around certain kinds of YouTube content. It's also, however, in my view, an important work on the subject of YouTube aesthetics. In particular, it's very good at drawing out some of the ways in which whether we choose to look at a video as art is likely to change the way we interpret it. The starting point of Zedig's discussion is the controversy that W.A.V.E's video The Aesthetic prompted amongst its fans.
Plenty of people who like the ContraPoints just as much as, if not more than me, didn't just dislike this video, but felt actively wounded and in some cases betrayed by it. And that sucks.
The reason the video got this reaction was largely because of certain arguments within it. Like most ContraPoints work that uses this dialogue format, the aesthetic allows for some seemingly reactionary positions to be voiced. Here it's the position that not only might it be politically advantageous for trans women to publicly perform femininity, but that in the current cultural climate, a trans woman's womanhood is virtually defined by doing so. This is an argument that's forcefully presented by the character of Justine.
Gender is performance. We're all born naked, and the rest is literally drag. Womanhood is not what you are, it's what you do. And trans women have to be virtuosas of womaning.
The reason this view could be called reactionary is because it seems to have the potential to deny some trans women womanhood, namely, those who aren't able to, or simply don't want to, conform to society's preconceived notions of femininity. In the aesthetic, while Tabby is allowed to push back against Justine's arguments with some forceful arguments of her own, the video ultimately refuses to offer a clear resolution to the character's debate.
Who do you think benefits, and who do you think gets hurt when you go out into the world and represent trans women as masculine and violent? Who do you think benefits when they trot you out to be feminine and meek and acquiescent? I guess we can't win, can we? You want to just chill out and watch YouTube videos?
This proved controversial with a small but vocal minority of W.A.V.E's large trans fan base, resulting in much criticism on Twitter and many video responses. At their most extreme, W.A.V.E's critics accused her of advocating precisely the same opinions as Justine. Zedig understands why the aesthetic got the reaction it did, and she admits that it, quote, fed her demons as a trans woman herself. She also explores the idea that part of the reason for the backlash amongst some fans is because they either believed that W.A.V.E was giving her own opinions when speaking as Justine, or they wanted her opinions on these topics to be made more clear.
It is, put charitably, ambiguous in its messaging, which makes us wonder what the author's intended message actually was. A major hang-up in this conversation is, are the opinions expressed in this video the opinions held by the characters, or are they the opinions held by Natalie Wynn? More specifically, is this oft-reiterated statement that gender isn't who you are, it's what you do, Natalie's personal conclusion, the Socratic truth she's trying to convey? And this is where that ambiguity really fucks us, because a whole hell of a lot of people give a shit what Natalie has to say.
These references to the video's, quote, message and what Natalie has to say begins to hint at what might change if the video was to be looked at not simply as a dialectical argument, but also as an artwork.
So why don't we take an admittedly difficult step back from all that and look at the aesthetic not as dialectic, but as art?
Several things begin to change once Zedig decides to approach the aesthetic in this way. The first thing is her sense of who or what we should look to as the source of the video's meanings. Having cited a couple of tweets by W.A.V.E to demonstrate what we might do if what we're trying to figure out is the opinions of Natalie Wynn, she then goes on to suggest that the relevance of this kind of evidence lessens if what we're trying to interpret aren't the views of a person, but instead the meanings of an artwork.
First of all, if it's art, we shouldn't even be having this conversation about intentionality, at least not yet. The Word of God debate exhausts me because it's almost always the least interesting aspect of any text. But what was the author's intention? Who cares? The author's dead. Let's just look at the thing and see what it has to say for itself.
This is a fundamentally different approach to interpretation than one that might involve citing tweets in order to discern W.A.V.E's personal views. If we look at the aesthetic as an artwork, then one thing Zedig says should change is that we'll no longer expect it to enlighten us about what W.A.V.E, the flesh and blood person, is saying about a topic. So treating it as art enacts that interpretive shift that's been common since even long before Barthes announced the death of the author, the assumption that the work in some sense speaks for itself. Zedig suggests that this means letting go of the notion of intention altogether. However, seeing what the thing has to say for itself to me instead implies that what we're really looking for is what Umberto Eco calls the intention of the text. Or, as D.H. Lawrence put it almost 100 years ago, never trust the artist, trust the tale. Something else that Zedig says should change if we treat Wyn's videos as art, as well as some by a couple of other YouTubers, is that we'll expect them to be finding different ways of making different kinds of meaning than much other video essay criticism, even if they're still offering what could broadly be called arguments.
These are still fundamentally argumentative video essays, but the argument is inextricable from the expression. The facts here, such as they are only important to us insofar as they relate to the narrative they've been tied to, whether that be personal, political, or esoteric.
The argument is inextricable from the expression. This actually reminds me of that old critical concept, the heresy of paraphrase, coined by the literary theorist Clemph Brooks in the 1940s. The so-called heresy Brooks was condemning was a mistake that he believed many critics at the time were making. They would read poems in search of a statement of some sort. Once they found it, they could judge it and the poem by whatever political or scientific or philosophical truth that statement might contain. By contrast, Brooks believed that poems couldn't be reduced to statements, summarizable or isolatable meanings, because of the kind of writing that poetry is. Unlike science or philosophy or political tracts, poems shouldn't be understood as offering literal statements at all, that is, pronouncements being made by the poet themselves. It's true that a poet might well write statements into their poem, but those statements are only designed to be understood in relation to all the other aspects of the poem's form as a poem, its structure, its rhyme scheme, its rhythm, and so on. And any of these specifically poetic ways that poems communicate have the power to affect the meaning of any statement, contextualizing, modifying, maybe even contradicting it. We could apply these insights to a video like The Aesthetic in at least two ways. Firstly, there's the basic idea that we shouldn't treat any work of YouTube art as if it were capable of having its meaning reduced to a statement. This is significant because a statement, a takeaway message, seems to be exactly what was wanted by those critics of The Aesthetic who objected to that video's ambiguities. For instance, one fan made a video response in which they argued that the format of characters having dialogue is a bad format. Why would you intentionally muddle your points with fictional characters and interpretation? After every one of these debates, Natalie needs to make a tweet thread explaining the intention of her video. These objections are entirely logical if we conceive of the video as a vehicle for statements from Natalie Wynn. But if we're interpreting it as an artwork, it would make less sense to believe that characters and ambiguity are simply muddling needlessly points that Wynn could have made more clearly in another medium. This brings us to a second way we might think about this notion of the argument being inextricable from the expression in relation to YouTube. Looking at something as YouTube art would mean not only looking at it as an artwork, but specifically as an audio-visual artwork. A work of art is usually assumed to speak not only for itself, but also in its own language. So, if looking at poetry as art requires us to interpret all the ways the poem expresses itself as a poem, then looking at an audiovisual text as art requires interpreting how it expresses itself as an audiovisual text, looking at a film as a film, or, in this case, YouTube as YouTube. One important outcome of this is that we can't expect we'll only need to interpret the words spoken in a video. We'll need to interpret the meanings created by its overall expression, the interplay between the words and the imagery, the narrative, the acting, shot composition, music, costume, lighting, editing, structure, visual metaphor, and so on. In other words, we'll assume that a video's meanings are being created through all the many ways that an audio-visual artwork can express itself that the spoken word alone can't. These are exactly the sorts of assumptions that guide Zedig in her analysis of The Aesthetic, and it results in her finding meanings in the video that she wouldn't have arrived at if she hadn't been looking at it as a work of audiovisual art. She bases her interpretation of the video on aspects like the relation of the framing device to the main dialogue.
So we start with a new character. Tracy is here to talk about quote-unquote color praxis, which we're led into
the significance of its references to other artworks.
There's a poster for pink flamingos right between Tabby and Justine to find the drag queen whose performance
The metaphorical resonances of its mise-en-scène.
Let's briefly touch on the mise-en-scène, which is just a pretentious college degree signaling way of saying all the stuff you see with your eyes. Divine's gun is aimed at Tabby, above which is a poster of the painted breakdown frames from another ContraPoints video, Tiffany
Its
Tumbles.
intertextual relationship to other ContraPoints videos that feature the same characters.
These are fragments of Natalie Wynn. In this case, we're led to one of Tabby's early appearances called The Left, which is
The way that Wynn's performances affect the meanings of the words her characters speak.
the only moment when she seems invested in what she's saying is at the end when she's handing it off to Tabby with a pronounced misgender and a vicious smile. This isn't a good
The symbolic meanings of an avant-garde montage that's seen on a TV screen within the video.
I think the plague montage is meant to show where this whole charade of disagreement is heading, to a parade of fractured, segmented identities unable to communicate or empathize.
The precise meanings that she attributes to all these aspects of the video, the overall upshot of this form of interpretation, is too complex to summarize here. And in a way, that's precisely the point. She interprets this video in the way that artworks demand to be interpreted if we want to appreciate them on their own terms. That is, without expecting it will offer a transparent communication between creator and audience, without assuming its meanings will be reducible to a paraphrasable statement, and guided by the assumption that it's going to be expressing itself through all the specifics of the medium in which it's made. And perhaps that's the most convincing case of all for considering the aesthetic as an artwork. Is the fact that this video made Zedig feel the need to approach it like this in order to understand it, and that the video absolutely responds to being interpreted in this way. So, let's try to draw some provisional conclusions. Maybe looking at something as art is likely to change the way we interpret it, but what can looking at YouTube videos in this way tell us about YouTube specifically?
Well, I don't know. What do I look like to you? Some kind of philosopher?
This is a question I plan to be thinking about for quite some time, and for the remainder of this series, so I don't have any earth-shattering theories to offer yet, but I'll finish with some half-baked thoughts on the subject anyway. One thing I feel sure of is that there are new and interesting genres of audiovisual art evolving on YouTube. Another thought that I'm toying with, though, is that perhaps one of the things that makes them so interesting is that some of these genres are developing out of types of YouTube video that aren't so easily categorizable as art. We've seen that at least some YouTubers are interested in the question of whether to think of what they're making as artworks. We've also seen that there can sometimes be resistance to interpreting YouTube videos in ways that would arguably be necessary for them to be appreciated in this way. At the heart of both these things lies that assumption that also lies at the heart of Zedig's question, what does YouTube art look like? Which is that maybe a lot of what we think of when we think of YouTube isn't best thought of as art, but is instead more easily thought of as something else. Towards the start of this video, I hinted that a possible candidate for what that something else could be is communication. Of course, despite the connections I drew between the phone call and the vlog, I don't mean actual interpersonal communication. What I'm talking about is communication as a mode of address. Videos whose style and rhetoric create the impression of a one-way but nonetheless direct communication between the audience and someone else, be that via talking to camera, or speaking in voiceover, or communicating via the written word. Some genres of film and TV use this mode of address too, of course, using presenters or hosts who apparently communicate directly to the viewer as themselves, offering them claims and observations about the same non-fictional world that they both inhabit. It was actually the relationship between TV presenters and viewers that first got people talking about the idea of parasocial interaction, to explain the illusion of face-to-face relationship with the performer that this mode of address can help create. However, it's become common to point out just how much online video seems to increase the potential for this kind of quasi-intimate interaction. And one reason for this is surely simply just how much closer a YouTube video can get to feeling like a direct communication than film or TV ever could. If it was already possible for mass media to create what Suzanne Eichner calls a media communication situation in which both parties act as if they were actually interacting, then in an age when many of us use video to create actual face-to-face communication, perhaps it's not surprising if the feeling of being communicated to directly by the creator of a vlog or a video essay can, increasingly, seem less like an illusion than ever. I think that one thing that might be going on when YouTubers question whether they're making art is they're asking themselves if they want to be understood as participating in this essentially communicative mode of address, whether they want to think of themselves as communicating directly to the viewer through their videos, or whether they want instead to express themselves in a different mode, the mode we've come to call art. And the reason that that would make a difference, of course, is because, as we've seen, the artistic mode of address tends to come with assumptions that run directly counter to those associated with communication. Put simply, the difference might be summarized by saying that, in contrast to the directness associated with communication, art seems like an unnecessarily indirect way to make a point. So, when Zedig asks us to look at the aesthetic as an artwork, what she's doing is effectively asking us to let go of the expectation that it might communicate a point directly, or even communicate a point at all. The reason this expectation exists in the first place, though, is powerful. It's because it's an entirely appropriate expectation to bring to so many genres of what we think of when we think of YouTube. It's also because Wynn's work grew out of, and is still generally seen as belonging to, those same genres. So in that sense, why is it any wonder that at least some fans wanted the aesthetic to be a more direct communication from Wynn? It seems to me that this potential uneasiness about how exactly it's addressing us could be a recurrent feature of YouTube art. Art that's native to and only makes sense on YouTube. This feeling it can give us that its mode of address exists in the blurred boundaries between communication and art, public rhetoric and aesthetic expression. If that's true, then it seems bound to continue to give rise to further debate and ever more difficult and interesting questions. On that point, following the backlash to the aesthetic, for many months Wynn actually backed away from her character-focused dialectic dialogue-style videos, largely opting instead for a far more traditional direct address presentation, in which she tended to speak as, and sometimes about, herself. On a live stream, she explained the decision this way.
I kind of haven't been doing characters lately because after the aesthetic, everyone seemed upset that I didn't say what my own personal opinion was, and people just tried to infer what my opinion was based on the video, and I was like, well, I may as well just sit in front of the camera and say what I think then.
So it seemed, for quite a while, that Wynn might have actually abandoned her experimentation with the kind of YouTube art that Zedig had begun to theorize. It was almost as if she'd felt unable to overcome the strength of expectation that what YouTube is for is primarily communication. However, just recently, she returned to her dialogue format once more with great success in the video Trans Trenders. And while I find her more traditionally communicative videos just as valuable and interesting for the ideas they explore, I'm also curious to see if she'll continue to find original, artistic ways of exploring them. I want to finish by adding one final clarification. ContraPoints makes among the most ostentatiously aesthetically stylized videos on YouTube, certainly on LeftTube, matched only maybe by Oliver Thorn's work for PhilosophyTube. And it's obvious that this is partly due to what we might call the production values available to Wynn. She's among the top earners on Patreon, and we can see this investment on the screen. So by using her as my first main example of a YouTube artist, I'm in danger of implying that making YouTube art could require this level of production values and this budget, which would just be another way of falling into the trap of elitism that discussions about art are always in danger of. But I don't think this is true. As I've been trying to articulate, I think we should view art primarily as a name for a particular mode of address. And an artistic mode of address is achievable on YouTube on virtually any budget. This might involve, say, making a more DIY style of dialogue debate videos, like this great one from Angie Speaks. Or it could involve, rather than making a straightforwardly communicative found footage documentary about neoliberalism, instead making a fictional mockumentary about neoliberalism, like this fantastic piece of work by Jack Saint. All that matters, I'd say, is that you shift your address so that you're using the audiovisual medium in a more indirect, dramatic, or metaphorical, or sensuous, or expressive way than simply using a video as if you were communicating directly to your viewer. In other words, not like this video you're watching. One of my favourite examples of this shift in mode of address takes place within a single video. It's by the YouTuber and musician Patricia Taxxon, who also made the music you're listening to right now, by the way. The video is The Case for Asset Flips. For most of its first half, it consists of a fairly straightforward video essay in which Taxxon defends the practice within indie video game development known as asset flipping, which is recontextualizing or recombining elements of existing games to create a new game. For the first 9 minutes, the video uses her characteristically layered superimposition approach to background images and clips, which is already distinctive and can be strangely beautiful. Nonetheless, for most of its first half, the video does still feel like a fairly traditionally communicative video essay, with Taxxon delivering argumentative points over the top of these images directly to us in voiceover.
How could the most life-changing and beautiful piece of interactive art belong to the same genre as Digital Homicide's work? Well, objectively, there's not really much difference. Really.
However, the video begins to make me want to appreciate it not just as communication, but also art, at around the midway point, when Taxxon's speaking voice drops out and something unexpected happens.
Competence doesn't correspond with worth. Incompetence does not guarantee worthlessness. Implying otherwise is bad for games and bad for gamers. So what's next?
Hop along and my rocket ship make 100 asset flips. And if you have a taste for a trip like this, I'm gonna show you some honest shit. Whoa, nobody can know what's next, so get in your Sunday's best. I'm telling ya, when we're done, there won't be anyone to tell you how to dress.
Say hey to the kid, throw no TT on the mix. Say we give him a spin, say hey to the kid, make it certain.
This originally composed song, which continues obliquely advancing the essay's arguments via Taxxon's lyrics, goes on playing for 4 minutes, before eventually ending, at which point Taxxon's speaking voice comes back in and she concludes her video essay. This was one of the most pleasing and surprising things I experienced on YouTube in the last year. Quite apart from the song itself being a stone cold tune, the way it was used in this context was just so striking for the way that it completely recontextualized the video's whole mode of address. It wasn't a communicative video essay any longer, it had made clear that it was expressing itself in totally different registers. Not only speech and image, but via speech, image, and song, and via the interplay between them. Furthermore, it was clear that the video was inviting me to interpret not just the lyrics, but the very music itself which conveyed meaning, especially the fact that it built its chords out of a sample of the Apple startup sound, which contributes implicitly, aesthetically, to the main argument about the validity of remix culture. Anyway, it was just a joyous example of how, without any expensive sets or green screen or costume, a YouTube video can become YouTube art. I'm keen to discover and study more work like this, within LeftTube and beyond. So if you've got your own favourite examples, please let me know in the comments, and I might look at them in future work. I'm hoping it won't be too long till the next video in this series, which I think is going to look at the practice of direct address and the whole idea of breaking the fourth wall on YouTube. Thanks so much for watching my first crazy long video essay. Till next time.
Take off your jacket, take off your pants, I'ma teach you how to dance. Let's kick it off!